Let's delve into how we can use pedigree charts to predict the inheritance of genetics disorders such as Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is a type of disease affecting movement, cognition, and mental health. We can represent its inheritance using a pedigree chart like the one shown on screen. A pedigree chart is a diagram that shows the occurrence and appearance of phenotypes of a particular gene or organism and its ancestors from one generation to the next, most commonly used to track the inheritance of genetic traits and diseases in humans. Before we continue, I'm just going to cover some common symbols and conventions. In pedigree charts, squares will generally represent males and circles will represent females. A filled symbol indicates an individual expressing the trait which is affected by the disorder. And a non-filled one will represent one not representing the disorder, and finally, horizontal lines connecting a male and a female represent mating, while vertical lines represent their offspring, lead to their offspring, Okay, so Huntington's disease is an example of an autosomal dominant condition, so just one affected allele is required for it to manifest. When I say autosomal, I'm just referring to genes located on chromosomes except the sex chromosomes. Remember that dominant indicates the presence of one mutated allele overriding the normal allele in determining the phenotype, as seen in Huntington's disease. So, in Huntington's disease, having a mutation in one allele suffices to express the disease phenotype, a dominant trait. The only scenario where an individual does not develop Huntington's disease is if both alleles are normal or recessive condition. Sorry, I just need to clear my throat. I'm losing my voice recently. Okay, I'm just going to go with that last point again because I didn't explain it. The only scenario where an individual does not develop Huntington's disease is if both alleles are normal, which is a recessive condition. So, we can predict the inheritance of these genetic disorders using Punnett squares. These squares depict normal potential genetic outcomes based on parental genotypes. Both unaffected carriers, one affected parent, or both affected parents. For carriers, or heterozygous individuals, the square shows a 50-50 chance of passing on the infected allele. This method is particularly relevant for understanding the genotypic and phenotypic ratios of offspring, clarifying who carries the gene and who displays the disease. We can actually use a similar logic for looking at an autosomal recessive inheritance. Autosomal recessive inheritance is a fundamental concept in genetics, distinct from autosomal dominant inheritance. In autosomal recessive inheritance, the phenotype of interest manifests only when an individual carries two copies of the mutated gene, one from each parent. This results in the condition being recessively inherited, meaning it typically appears in homozygous individuals, where both alleles of the gene are mutated. A classic example illustrating autosomal recessive inheritance is albinism. Albinism is characterized by a lack of pigment production in the skin, hair, and eyes, resulting in a pale appearance. For an individual to exhibit the albino phenotype, they must inherit two recessive alleles, one from each parent, that disrupt the production of pigment proteins. To understand how autosomal recessive traits are inherited, Punnett squares are commonly used. These squares visually represent the possible genetic combinations that can result from the mating of two individuals, showing the possibility of offspring inheriting specific genotypes and phenotypes. In the case of albinism, a Punnett square would illustrate the offspring that need to inherit offspring need to inherit two copies of the recessive allele, one from each parent, to express the albino phenotype. The concept of half-half becomes particularly relevant in the context of autosomal recessive disorders. Unlike autosomal dominant disorders, where individuals with just one copy of the mutated gene can exhibit the phenotype, recessive disorders often remain hidden as carriers in the heterozygous state. This means carriers do not show symptoms but can pass on the mutated allele to their offspring. Therefore, understanding the pedigree of a family, tracing the inheritance of alleles across generations, is crucial for identifying carriers and predicting the likelihood of offspring inheriting the disorder. You'll more often than not see autosomal recessive inheritance, where because a disease will generally be the recessive trait. That is because diseases are generally a non-functional protein, so they will get overridden by a functional one. You'll see this a lot more if you explore it at a higher level. But for the moment, grasping these principles through Punnett squares and pedigrees allows you to gain an insight into how autosomal recessive disorders are inherited and why genetic counselling and testing are essential for families with a history of such conditions. This knowledge empowers us to make informed decisions regarding healthcare and family planning, ensuring the well-being of future generations.